in that moment, your heart rate goes up, you're releasing stress hormones into your bloodstream. If you can just step away from that situation, if you can just walk away from it for a little bit and self-soothe for 20 minutes, like don't think about the argument, don't think about the fight, don't think about what's happening, like go listen to music or whatever for 15 to 20 minutes. Even if you just need to take a break and like leave the house and go for a walk, just go ahead and do that. And that is how long it takes your body to physiologically calm down. Hi, and welcome to the Stethoscopes to Swaddles podcast, episode number 72. Today on the podcast, I will be talking about a concept that was coined by the Gottman Institute that is one of the predictors of divorce, and that is the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Now, if you are into Greek mythology, actually it's not Greek mythology, it's actually biblical mythology or biblical stories. Please don't come for me. There's a concept of the Four Horsemen. It's in the Bible, and I have a confession for those of you who are Christians like me. The book of Revelations really scared me as a kid, and I just decided that I would just never want to read it. So there's that. But in the book of Revelations, the Four Horsemen appear, and they're basically the predictors of the end of time. And so I don't want to assume how the Gottman Institute came up with this concept, but basically in the Bible, in the book of Revelations, these four horsemen came to portray like four disastrous things that were going to take place before the second coming of Jesus Christ. And there's all these arguments, and like I said, I am like freaked out by the book of Revelations, and yeah, I also don't desire to coach myself on why I should read that book in the Bible. For today's topic, basically what the Gottman Institute researched, they came up with these ideas of like the predictors for divorce, and we'll talk about some of them in a few podcasts later, but I just wanted to kind of go back to the concept and how they came up with it. So again, these four horsemen in the end of times in the New Testament, they describe conquest, war, hunger, and death. And so the Gottman Institute uses this metaphor to describe communication styles that can predict the end of a relationship. And so they take that information and they basically looked at their research based on the Love Lab, all their therapy sessions with their clients, and they came up with these four really critical concepts that I think we should all at least know about. Today, I'm going to talk about those four, and I'm also going to talk about their antidotes. Before I get started, I just want to say, if you're noticing any of these four horsemen in your relationship, that is actually great because you have awareness of it. If after listening to this podcast, you realize this has actually been more present than you imagined it was, I think it would be good to reflect on that and just notice that and decide for yourself. The other thing that I thought about is having, gone through like some relationships changing form in my life in the last year. I think these four horsemen actually do come even in non-marital relationships. And so if you're struggling with any other relationship in your life, I think this is worth just understanding. And then I'm going to give you some of the antidotes and how you can, decide to show up differently in order to address them. So let's get started. Hey, Mama, you deserve a life free of overwhelm and burnout. Welcome to the Stethoscopes to Swaddles podcast. I'm your host, life and mindset coach, Shiro Bergbauer. I'm also a wife, mom, and CRNA. This is the podcast for high-achieving mamas in medicine like you and I. Together, we'll learn how to navigate the ups and downs of working motherhood. If you're looking to thrive in your relationships and overcome overwhelm in your motherhood, marriage, and medicine, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Stethoscopes to Swaddles podcast. So the four horsemen, according to the Gottman Institute, are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And we'll go into each of them, and then we'll talk about the antidotes of each of them. So what is criticism? So many times when we as, partners, wives, husbands feel criticized, we may sometimes not be objective, whether it's a complaint or a criticism. So I thought before I actually start, I should share just some insights on the differences between the two. What I wanted to first start with is, how do you know if something is a criticism versus a complaint from your spouse? So a criticism is very different from a complaint in that a criticism is a global expression of something. And it's an expression of negative feelings or opinions about another person's character or personality. It also usually has a connotation of the person saying, you always, you never, you usually, very, very global. When you think about a criticism, it's really an attack, right? It's an attack on the other person's the core of their character. And it's you literally just dismantling their whole being when you start to criticize them. A complaint, on the other hand, is about a specific issue. When you offer a critique or voice a complaint, it's more like saying, there's always a component of it that's you express how you feel about something, and it's a very specific situation. And then you say what you need or what you want or what you prefer. So I'll give you an example that the Gottman Institute uses, because I think it was just actually, I'm going to give you an example I gave to my coaching client. So the context of this was that the spouse was upset and raising their voice. My client felt very upset about it. And then she offered him this feedback. You never think about your behavior, and you never control your temper. You're just you're self-centered. A complaint would look like, I was very anxious when you raised your voice because I felt unsafe in that moment. So notice how in the complaint, the individual is stating exactly how they felt in that moment, and also what they needed, right? So in that moment, I needed to step away. I was feeling flooded. It's such a huge difference, right? Now, if you find that criticism is very common in your marriage, don't assume that this is the end of times, right? But just be aware that when criticism becomes the major form of communication in a relationship, it's a doorway of entry for all the other horsemen to enter the relationship. Because one, the recipient of the criticism usually starts to feel emotions like they feel assaulted, they feel rejected, they feel hurt. And then it's just the pattern just starts to escalate. Now, before I go to the next horseman, I want to say that in my coaching practice, one thing that I have noticed with my clients is that when criticism is present in their marriage, one of the reasons why they don't address it is because, one, it feels like a personal attack on their self and their core of who they are and whether they belong and all of that. So many of my clients have shared with me the thought that when their partner criticizes them, then they start to believe that they're not good enough. They're not a good mother. They're not a good wife. They're not a good human being. They're not smart enough. All of that. It's so important to be in awareness that when your partner criticizes you and they start to bring up something about your personality or something about who you are as a person, to really step away from that self-critique of then deciding that, oh, that must mean I'm not good enough. That must mean that I am not smart enough. That must, let's say your partner says something about how you spent money, and you say to yourself, they are saying something about how I spent money, therefore that must mean I'm very bad with money, right? Versus just saying, hey, I notice you have this, you have this feedback for me, And I want to talk about it because when you say these things, I feel like my ability to make decisions with money are being questioned. So just notice, like, when your partner criticizes you, do you then take that as a not enough like mindset? Like, do you start to turn around and instead of exercising self-compassion, you may even start to agree with them, like, yo, maybe they're right. Maybe I really am sloppy. Maybe I'm really aloof, or maybe I really am selfish, like whatever descriptor they use. One of the things, especially for people who have had maybe very little awareness of their inner child and what their inner child needs, sometimes that criticism can present as a pain body. And I've talked about this in the past. It's where there's something in your past that for you is a trigger. So like criticism for many people is a trigger, for me included. When that person criticizes you, you may then have this like reaction like that is way beyond what was being said in the moment. And so I think when you really, really like just realize that, okay, what if I'm objective, even though I'm feeling criticized at this moment? What if I'm objective? Like, what can I take away from this feedback? And then how can I share what I need? Like, how can I tell my spouse what I need in this moment? And it doesn't have to happen at that exact moment. It can be, I'm going to step away and I'm going to like calm myself down. And then I'm going to come back to this conversation and I'm going to ask for what I need. So I really just think that if we could do that, we can really, really, really show up for ourselves and speak for what we need, but have the awareness that we don't have to have the other person like manage that emotional response for us. So that is the first horseman. Now, what is the antidote for the criticism horseman? It is a gentle startup. And just like I shared, it's when you start to talk, if you're feeling like you're going to criticize your partner, instead of offering them criticism, attacking their behavior, saying you always, you never, you are this, you are not this, say, use I statements. So it's like you start your statement with an I and express what you need in a positive manner. So, for example, let's say you, instead of saying to your spouse, why are you so selfish? You can say, I feel left out. Can we like, please connect? Like, can we talk about what you're going through, what I'm going through, right? If you start the antidote with I feel, then you can lead into I need, and you can respectfully ask for the person to help you fulfill that need. Notice you're not blaming them, you're not criticizing them, and you help to prevent the discussion from escalating into an argument. I have noticed for myself, there are some things that my husband is very expressive about, and a lot of it has to do with like clutter or mess or, you know, doing things incorrectly. And I started to notice that actually when I, even if he was going to start off with a criticism, like when I can just ask him, like, what do you need in this moment? So I'll give you a small example that happened today. The room that I record my podcast in is also kind of sort of like my hoarding room. Like I just store a lot of stuff there. And he just happened to walk by and he sent me a picture of it. And my first reaction was like, oh, come on, like it's not that dramatic. And then I asked him, I was like, what does that photo mean? Because I was in a different room. And he was like, I feel like this mess is escalating. And I go, okay. I said, actually, I had gone in there to take some stuff out. And I go, why does that bother you? And he goes, because mess affects me and it stresses me out. And I was like, okay, I'll take care of it. Like, let's just move on, right? Just notice how I just wanted to understand where that feedback was coming from, instead of going at it like you always say, like you always pick on me, or you always look into what I'm doing. And I'm able to understand what he needed in that moment, and then just let him explore that for him, right? Horseman number 2 is contempt. And this comes from when we have a sense of superiority over our partner. And it's actually a form of disrespect because we start to kind of be uppity. We start to feel like we have the upper hand. We start to feel like we're better than them and we know everything. Usually, sarcasm, cynicism, eye rolling, mockery, and hostile humor come up a lot in contempt. Whatever form that contempt shows up in your marriage, just be aware that it is all dangerous to the relationship, right? There's a saying, it's a saying that says like familiarity breeds contempt. And to me, the way I think about it is, it's not that like if you're familiar with somebody, you can be contemptuous towards them. It's more of when you just have no more regard for the person's emotional well-being, then you you could be mean to them. I had a situation where somebody felt that I had hurt them and they didn't say those words to me. Instead, they were very sarcastic. They were very contemptuous. I felt like I was just kind of like they were disgusted by my presence. And to me, that actually was so much more hurtful than them just saying straight up like what was happening. And so just notice when you get in contempt that the goal of contempt is to make the other person feel despised and worthless. And it goes beyond criticism, because criticism, you're attacking the person's character. Contempt means that you're assuming a position of moral superiority over them. I have been in a situation where I felt contempt towards somebody, not my spouse, but a friend. And it was more like in my mind, I had this thought error that I was better than them. And it was just like every time I had to be in a situation with this person, my body language was very clear that I didn't want to be in their presence. And of course, that didn't help the situation, right? So interestingly, research shows that couples that are contemptuous of each other are more likely to suffer from infectious illnesses such as colds, the flu, than other people because of their immune systems being weakened. And that has a lot to do with your being in fight or flight all the time and your cortisol levels being high and all of that. I just want to say, if you are at this stage in your relationship, this is a huge, huge warning sign. Out of the Four Horsemen, contempt, out of actually all the predictors, contempt is the greatest predictor of divorce. And so it has to be eliminated. It needs to be taken care of as soon as possible before the boat capsizes. It's not even an option. If you are in contempt, I just want you to stop and notice it and decide to take action if you want to save your relationship, whether it's marriage, friendship, your relationship with your kids. Stop right now, unless you're driving. Make a decision for yourself. Do I want to end the cycle of contempt or not? And if you decide that you don't want to end it, just be in awareness that you may be making a decision to also end the relationship long term. There's also another concept of belligerence, which is a close cousin of contempt. And it's just as deadly. It's a form of aggressive anger because it usually contains a threat of provocation. The example they offered is when a wife complains that her husband doesn't come home from work in time for dinner, and the husband's belligerent response will be, well, what are you going to do about it? Or if somebody says something and you're like, what are you going to do? Sue me? It's such a belligerent response. Yeah, you might think it's a joke, but it's actually one, hurtful, and two, it's the very depth of contempt. You have now decided you do not care and you're not going to do anything about it. And you're literally just not going to you've checked out, basically. You have absolutely checked out of the relationship and you do not care what the impact of your words are to the person, right? So I just want you to just practice that awareness. If you're noticing contempt is showing up in your relationship, really, really, really check in with yourself, with your partner, and both of you make a decision. What are you going to do about that? Because it can only cause more pain in the marriage, more pain in the relationship, more pain in the relationship with your kids, all of that. Just want you to just have that awareness. This in itself can be such a, what am I trying to think of? it can just be like the thing that you could focus on changing, and it could 100% change your relationship. So I just thought I would offer that because so many people like may feel stuck in that situation and not think like, oh, there's actually a way out of this mess. And I'm going to tell you what that is, which is the antidote to contempt. And that is building a culture of appreciation and respect. So if you start to create little ways of appreciating each other, and I like the idea of small things often, which is regularly expressing appreciation, gratitude, affection, and respect for your partner, you start to create a positive perspective in your relationship, and that serves as a buffer. Another thing is that the little things, and I learned this concept from my friend Maggie Reyes, who is the marriage life coach, is that when you have these little building blocks, right, these bids, and you do these bids often, which goes back to the previous series about, connecting, when you create this, it's like an emotional bank account. So when you have built so much in that little emotional bank account, when a negative event shows up, you're more likely to make a withdrawal from the emotional bank account that serves your marriage, that serves your relationship. The other thing is the concept of what the Gottman Institute calls the 5-to-1 magic ratio of positive to negative interactions that a relationship has to have in order to succeed. So for each negative interaction, if you have 5 or more positive interactions, you're making a huge deposit into your emotional bank account, which keeps that in the green, right? Okay, so contempt example is you roll your eyes and you're like, oh, great, you forgot to, do the laundry, or great, you forgot to, you didn't even clean up after yourself, and you roll your eyes and you click or whatever. And the antidote is like, I know you've been busy lately, but could you please remember to, do the laundry when I'm working late? I'd really appreciate it. Just notice like it's a subtle request, but it's not creating this environment where your partner may feel attacked. So that is number 2. Horseman number 3 is defensiveness. So defensiveness is obviously like usually a response to criticism, but what happens in defensiveness is that instead of taking the feedback, right? If you feel attacked, for example, in a conversation, it's understandable that you want to defend yourself, right? But if the other person is already showing up and being nasty or rude and you start to defend yourself, you will be more likely to then attack your spouse, and you will not, it's not going to create an apology from the person, or they're not going to back down, because really what you're doing in defensiveness is then blaming your partner. So it can look like your partner says, they criticize you. They say you never clean up after yourself. And then you say, well, you never pay the bills on time, because it's like you're feeling like a form of defensiveness. And one of the ways we do it is like, the problem isn't me, it's you. So it's that innocent victim stance, like it sends a message like, oh, you're picking on me, and like, what about all these other good things I do? But it just escalates conflict. I always think of Byron Katie's saying, defense is the first act of war. When we get in defense, we are slowly opening the door to more conflict. And sometimes we open the door real hard, right? Because defense only escalates conflict, which is why it makes it so critical to notice when we're being defensive. Recently, I had a client ask me in a workshop, she said, why is it that women, we have to do all the work? And there's like a lot of like biology and like that explains like why like we obviously tend to be the more like nurturing, solution focused species compared to men. But the other thing that I think was so interesting in this is when we start to like basically keep stock of who's solving the problem, does it really matter who notices and solves the problem as long as the problem is solved, right? Like, I think for many of us, we've grown up in this environment where it's like, I did this, you didn't do this. I did this, you didn't do this. But like the way I look at it is if you're headed for divorce and one of you picks up the responsibility of saving the relationship, if the relationship is saved and the marriage thrives and your children have live in a home where they can mirror a healthy marriage, does it really matter who took the first step? Like, I just want you to think about that. Like, when you think, oh, my spouse should be picking up the slack in this relationship, does it really matter who picks up the slack as long as the problem is solved, right? Like for me in anesthesia, I always think like, I always tell myself, no ego, amigo. Like, and it's something I think I learned from Peloton, but it's like when I'm in a case and I work in a care team for the most part, I don't really have an ego about who gets to intubate the patient or who gets to place the arterial line. Now, I will tell you, I used to. Like, I used to be like, oh, this person's trying to one-up me. And now the way I look at it is, it doesn't matter who does the thing as long as it's in the best interest of the patient. And that has served me so well. And it's interesting because, like, I'll talk to friends who, like, get frustrated being in this model. And I'm like, is it because, are you worried about the patient's outcome or are you just like trying to solve for something for yourself, right? So I just wanted to offer that because, again, it doesn't really matter who makes the first step as long as it's in the best interest of the relationship, right? So just notice for yourself, even notice for yourself in the workplace. Like, are you always trying to be the person in charge? Are you always trying to like, you want to beat everybody to the punch to fulfill a certain ego boost for yourself? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's only human. Like, it's only natural that we want to do that. But is it in full service of the people we're taking care of? So that is defense. And now we're going to talk about the antidote to defense. Now, remember we talked about defense being as a self-protection in the form of righteous indignation or innocent victimhood, right? We're trying to like ward off a perceived attack. We don't solve the problem, right? So when you take responsibility, that is the antidote to defensiveness. It's taking ownership. And I have like spent so much time in the last year and a half learning how to take massive responsibility for myself. Like taking ownership of everything that's happening and deciding I am going to be the best version of myself 100% of the time. This serves in a way like, instead of like trying to defend my honor, so to speak, I'm like, you know what? What if they're right? Like, what if this person is actually right? Am I going to spend more time finding out how wrong they are? Or would it serve me better to spend more time finding out how to do better, right? Because again, how much can I control for the other person's perception of me? How much can I control for the other person's experience, right? Because a lot of the time, especially if it's a criticism, then I'm deciding that there's something I can do or say that can change this person's thoughts about me. And the reality is that person's actions, thoughts, and feelings, they control that. I cannot manipulate their model. I can't go in there and say, I want you to think this thought of me, so I'm going to do this thing. It was so interesting. I had a conversation with my coach, and she just like helped me see it so clearly that we've been socialized as women to truly believe that other people's actions, we can somehow manage them for them. So it's the cook and clean and be a good woman so he'll marry you. Take care of yourself so he'll stay. And then it's like when, for example, when there's a relationship and the partner cheats and it's like, but I took good care of myself, but I was a good wife, as if our actions control the other person's actions, right? Like that person's decision to step out of the marriage has nothing to do with your actions. It has a lot to do with what their thoughts were and what they wanted in a relationship. And maybe they weren't getting it in the one they're in, or they wanted more of it, but your actions don't actually control that. And I think it's such a freeing thing. Like, to me, it helps me understand like the Buddhist concept of non-attachment, because then I can only take ownership of myself. I take full responsibility for myself. So I just want you to notice when defensiveness shows up, are you taking responsibility or are you giving up the responsibility to the other person? By taking responsibility for the part that we have played in the conflict, even when we can assert our desires, it helps us like prevent the conflict from escalating because we can take ownership of the role we played in building up that conflict. And then When we take responsibility, then we can come up with a compromise or like a step ahead. We can move the needle forward rather than like just spinning around in defensiveness, and just like it's not solving any problem. The last horseman of the apocalypse is stonewalling. Now, I'm going to tell you this, Mama. I used to love stonewalling, and I used to think it's a perfect solution to a problem. And so stonewalling is when you withdraw from the interaction, you shut down, or you just simply stop responding. And so instead of confronting the issue that you have, when you stonewall, you can just like tune out or turn away or act busy. You just like remove yourself from the scenario, but you're still in the scenario. And notice that when this becomes your frequent out, it becomes a bad habit. And unfortunately, it's not easy to stop stonewalling. Now, stonewalling is usually a result of us being like feeling so flooded physiologically that we just are we feel fight or flight and then we freeze, right? And one of the things about stonewalling is that it actually, like in our minds, we're like, yeah, I'm solving for the problem because I'm stepping away from like talking about the problem. But what happens is that these conflicts that are not solved over and over in our relationships, they become like persistent, like parasites in the relationship. So they might not come up like right away, but it's like after a little bit, you're just like, why am I having this like crazy reaction to what he's doing right now in the moment when it doesn't even correlate, right? So I was talking to one of my clients and she said something to the effect of like, oh, his behavior doesn't bother me anymore. I just tune it out. And what I was helping her understand, like at the end of the day, when you haven't actually had awareness of the behavior, it still bothers you to an extent, right? When you actually stonewall, you haven't solved for it because what you're doing is just like, again, building this wall between you and your partner, but like eventually it comes crashing down. So if you're the kind of person who tends to, in a conflict, like just stop talking or give your partner the cold treatment or silent, and you, in your mind, you believe that like you're so conflict averse, I just want to offer you that stonewalling, it's still a form of conflict, right? Because it leaves the other person wondering like, are we good? Are we solving the problem? And I'm not saying like every time there's a conflict, you just stay in the conflict. And I'm going to go ahead and offer you the antidote to stonewalling in just a little bit. When you feel physiologically flooded, right? And I want to explain this. It's you feel so defenseless against the attack that you learn to do nothing in order to avoid a replay. So notice like how you're feeling in that moment. Are you feeling like your heart rate going up? Are you feeling like, you're scared? Are you feeling like you're going to vomit? What I want to offer you in stonewalling, when you feel the need to, when this has become the persistent way in which you solve problems in your marriage, what I want to offer you is to learn how to physiologically self-soothe. What that usually means is interrupting the argument and ask for a break. And I think I've offered this on the podcast before. If you are in a relationship with somebody who might feel uncomfortable with that, you can just tell them, I'm going to step away for 20 minutes and I'll be back. And what they actually, and I forget where I read this and I might be misquoting it, but in that moment, your heart rate goes up, you're releasing stress hormones into your bloodstream. If you can just step away from that situation, if you can just walk away from it for a little bit and self-soothe for 20 minutes, like don't think about the argument, don't think about the fight, don't think about what's happening, like go listen to music or whatever for 15 to 20 minutes. Even if you just need to take a break and like leave the house and go for a walk, just go ahead and do that. And that is how long it takes your body to physiologically calm down. And in that time frame, what I want to ask you to practice doing is to avoid having like thoughts of like you're better than the person. You're like, I don't have to take this anymore, or he's always picking on me. Like spend time doing something that is soothing and distracting to you. And it doesn't matter exactly what it is as long as it actually helps you calm down. So what I always think about is think about a way that if your child came to you and was like crying because their friend had been mean to them and you sat with them in that moment, what would you do and say to them? Would you give them a hug? Would you hold their hand, right? Notice like when you're feeling flooded. And I think a lot of us don't actually notice when the flooding is coming. And so we don't actually realize we're in fight or flight, right? So again, one of the things is to not criticize you're feeling the way you're feeling. I always like try to think to myself, of course my brain thinks we're in danger. So it's trying to protect me. And so my brain wants to like freeze, right? And that's okay. Instead of freezing, I'm going to soothe it. I'm going to like give myself a hug, right? And I'm going to commit that my job, again, going back to taking responsibility, my job is to really take care of myself, right? At the end of the day, I take care of me. I can't change this person's thoughts about me or their actions or what they're doing, but I can just turn inwards by hitting the pause button. And so you just take a quote unquote timeout. In our house, we call it a timeout. And based on something I learned from Sue Johnson's work, when you do take the time out, just let the person know how long it's going to be so they don't also now spend time flooded like, oh, she's not going to come back and talk to me. So what I like to do is taking calming breaths. So I'll do either square breathing, where it's like you inhale for 5 seconds, hold the breath, exhale for 5, hold for 5, inhale for 5, until I start to notice my heart rate go down. And sometimes what I'll do is just like put both hands on my chest and just tell myself, I'm going to be okay. This is a feeling and it's going to pass. And I recently discovered tapping. I think it's like really been great to just help me like in situations where, of course, I can't close my eyes or, try to self-soothe in public. I'll just like, there's a karate chop point, which is like along like your thumb. And I just like tap on it, and I'll put in the show notes a link to the tapping solution app. But it's really helped me just like learn how to self-soothe in moments where I might not be able to like exit the scenario, like exit the scene, right? It happened recently when I was going to possibly run into somebody that I don't speak to anymore, or rather who doesn't speak to me anymore. And I was like feeling like I was going to be in this panic. And I just told my brain like, yeah, of course I know you want to protect me. Like you want me to run because you feel like danger is around the corner, but we're going to be okay. And so I just like tapped my hand and like soothed myself and reminded myself that of course I'm going to have this reaction, right? Like how human of me. This is something I learned from Kara Lowenthal. Like how human of me. Of course I'm going to have this reaction. Isn't it just so beautiful to just be like, yeah, of course I'm going to try to freak out. Because I'm human. I'm not a robot. Like how human of me to feel these feelings and allow myself to be. So that is the fourth horseman and its antidote. Soon we'll dig into some of the other concepts and, we'll talk a little bit more about the other predictors of divorce and relationships. I just wanted to have this podcast and just like focus on those 4 because I think they're so critical and bring them out in a way that maybe lightens the information and brings it closer to home. And again, this is part of the Gottman Institute work. And I always like to share like in the show notes, the link. And this is work that I'm actually working on for one of the programs. And it's the 7 principles for making marriage work. And so it's important for us to know the things that can cause this ship to capsize, right? Before we go out on a sailing trip, right? So I wanted to share that with you today and bring it closer to home. And I hope that it maybe opened up some ideas and thoughts for you and that you'll put them in practice. So again, to summarize, we talked about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and their antidotes. And the 4 horsemen are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And I also wanted you to know that they don't always come in your marriage in a strict order. Sometimes they can be like a relay match. One takes over, the other one starts. One takes over, the other one starts. Just notice them for what they are. Commit to yourself to use the antidotes to solve for the problems, and then give yourself permission to be human, that sometimes these may be your default ways of responding to conflict, right? And when they show up, don't beat yourself up. Just remind yourself, oh, now I know the tools and I know the information that I can use to go back to baseline. So I want you to focus on building your emotional bank accounts. Remember, we talked about that 5-to-1 ratio. Build up those emotional bank accounts so that when there's conflict, you have something to draw from to create stability and to create emotional security in your relationship. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. And I apologize for the pause that I had taken for a couple of weeks. I still have the episode with my husband planned. It's coming. I just needed a little bit of a mental health break, but I am back. And I am actually getting ready to go to Cabo San Lucas as I'm recording this. And I definitely need the break. And so I hope you have a good week. And I'll talk to you next week. Bye now. I'm Shira Bergbauer, and you've been listening to the Stethoscopes to Swaddles podcast. New episodes are out every Monday. These episodes are created by me, Shira Bergbauer, and produced by Cassidy Mitchell. If you enjoyed this show or found it helpful, please rate it and review us on Apple Podcasts. If the concepts I share on this podcast resonate with you, or you're ready to change your relationships and mindset, I can help you. If you'd like in-depth, personalized support, I'd love to invite you to apply for my Life and Mindset coaching program. Just imagine you and I every week working together as I teach you the tools to up-level your life. To book your free 1-hour consultation call, go to www.stethoscopestoswaddles.com/consultation. You're doing a great job, Mama. Have a great week. Bye now.